Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you immensely for joining us on your Pan-African program, Voice Eat, where we get to talk matters affecting the African continent. Today we're discussing insecurity, and over the years the African continent has been plagued with insecurity, or this cankerworm called insecurity, despite efforts by numerous heads of state to ensure that it comes to an end. From the Anglophone crisis in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon to terrorist attacks in Nigeria, tavern killings in South Africa, the crisis in the Sahel region, the M23 rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo. On a daily basis, several cases of reported inhumane practices, human rights violation, displacement, and others are recorded. As we can only ask ourselves what can be done to get out of this situation. What measures are supposed to be put in place by these various governments to make sure that this comes to an end? Stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We shall be unpacking this and many more in the course of this program. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Voice It, your Pan-African program, where we get to discuss matters affecting the African continent. Today, joining me in the studio is Mr. Asonkumba. He is a legal expert with the Rwandan Bar Association, as well as a medical doctor with the Cameroon Medical Council. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Madam.
It's a pleasure having you here on board. Equally, one of our panelists is joining us all the way from Cameroon's political capital. He is Mr. Njine Bane, the National Communications Secretary for the Popular Actions Party. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, madam. Good afternoon to my co-panelists back there with you in the studio. Good afternoon to all viewers from Afrique Media, and good afternoon to all Africans. It's a pleasure being on your platform this afternoon.
Unfortunately, this is for you media, this is for you television. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin unpacking what Africa or insecurity on the African continent and what brought us this far, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a listen to this report. From time immemorial, insecurity has plagued the African continent, despite efforts put in place by heads of state to calm down the tensions. From Cameroon to Nigeria, Sudan, Uganda, South Africa, Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, every African country has its pain to swallow. According to Agnes Arimayo Anes, prominent Ghanaian investigative journalist, for every story to be balanced, mediators have to find the missing voices. Linking his view to conflict resolution, no crisis can be resolved without all the parties involved being present on the dialogue table. Legal expert Asonkumba was of that assertion when he said the brokered ceasefire agreement between Rwanda's Paul Kagame and Congo's Felix Tshisekedi was biased, given a representative from the M23 rebels was absent. In that light, the M23 rebel street spokesperson Willy Ngoma reiterated they were Congolese, not Rwandans, and any negotiations could be between them and the Congolese government. These escalating tensions have led to killings of civilians, including women and children, human rights violations, and the displacement of persons in all these countries. And like is the case in Benin, fear looms over the place. How can the African continent be rejuvenated? Do we have what it takes to revamp the continent? Time alone has answers. Thank you for that report, Mr. Nkumayo. I've listened to this detailed report. So if we have to begin from the basics, what do you think accounts for this rising insecurity across the African continent?
Well, it's really rather unfortunate that Africa is going through a lot of insecurity crisis. But from my own point of view, I strongly believe that Africa's insecurity problem is linked to bad governance. Because actually, as emanates from almost every constitution of every state in the world, security is a constitutional obligation which is being attached to the head of state. And the head of state is the one to make sure that his territorial boundaries, his population are secured. And as such, not only going according to constitutional rights or obligations, but also in accordance to international laws. For example, international conventions that actually foster civil and political rights, those for children, those for women, the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. All these are different international conventions which actually help to provide security in different member states of the UN. And the head of state has the obligation to make sure that there is security. So I think that the problem actually stems from bad governance. But in bad governance, there are other different factors which actually encroach into this duty, which actually makes the situation worse. So we could actually take, for example, if we have cultural conflicts, for example, it means that the state has failed to actually make the population feel that they are one, that they are a nation. And that is the role of the state, to be able to unite people. We all have different origins, but the notion of a nation is one which the president has to use all his means, or all the means available to him, to be able to unite people under one canopy, and that is the nation.
Exactly. We shall be coming back to what you did mention on bad governance, but first, let's get the point of view of Mr. Ginebane regarding this rising insecurity across the African continent.
Yes, madam. If we talk about insecurity across the African continent, I would say there are a number of things that account for such rise of insecurity. Some of the case of insecurity stem as way back as even before the independence of some of our African countries. Some of them have to do with some of the accords that were signed before or during the independence process in some of those African countries, especially the French colonies. And then, of course, like my co-panelist in the studio has mentioned now, we also do have the issue of bad governance that has also contributed enormously to the insecurity we have in the continent. You know, when we talk about insecurity here, we can view from different perspectives. We talk about insecurity in terms of maybe food insecurity, lack of social. I mean, all these things are things that combine to threaten the well-being of the citizens. And of course, when people don't feel comfortable within their countries, when people don't feel comfortable within their insecurity, within their societies, there is bound to be insecurity. So the insecurity in Africa, we say there are a number of factors that do account for all of this. And I think until our leaders that are there, unfortunately, many of them being just stooges who work for themselves and not for the interest of the people, but until these leaders begin to change their mentality, until Africans themselves begin to understand that there is a need for them to fight for better governance within the African continent, then I'm afraid that such insecurity has a long way to go as far as Africa is concerned.
So, Mr. Mbane, if I had to ask you this question, how did we get here? What would you say?
Okay. It takes me back to what I just started by saying. How did we get here? Let us go back even before the colonial period. Many of the African countries before independence, and I want to cite here particularly the French colonies, for instance, you see, many of them were hurriedly pushed into an independence that they were not prepared for, and the real fathers who fought for the independence of these countries never even saw the independence themselves, because they were killed or jailed or simply pushed out of the way, and some students were brought in who accepted to sign certain accords with France that today we are paying the price for it. You see, if you take the African colonies, former colonies, where people have engagements and more than 50% of their reserves are stored in France, then you understand that financially speaking, economically speaking, these colonies are not independent, and so the people do not reap the benefits of their labor. On the contrary, France is the one benefiting from such things. And because at the end of the day, the economies are bad in Africa, and the people cannot be gainfully employed and all whatnot, with the rise of unemployment and other issues, health and all whatnot, these people are forced at one point in time maybe to rise up now with the use of arms to want to think that they could better off their lives from this perspective. Secondly, how did we get here? When you take some of the present leaders that we have, who are dictators, who believe that they cannot sit down when there is a political misunderstanding in the country and dialogue with their opponents, and rather think that brutality is the only means they can use, it also leads to insecurity, because when you push the people to the wall, at the end of the day, they are forced to bounce back and want to retaliate. And so, of course, we understand why some of the conflicts we have in the continent today are as an influence of the type of authoritarian regimes or leaders that we have in place, who believe that they cannot sit down and dialogue with those who do not share their political views. On the contrary, they want to go through brutality. We also talk about things like marginalization. It still has to go with bad governance. If you take the case of Cameroon, for instance, if the Anglophone regions today are under have been categorized by a war for close to 6 years today, it is because for over 60 years they have been marginalized. And again, like I mentioned, nobody is willing, as far as the regime is concerned, to sit down and dialogue with them and rather things that issues that are political can be settled through the barrel of the gun. And of course, you understand why for the past 6 years now, there has been total insecurity in that part of the country as far as Cameroon is concerned. We also have situations like the M23 that you made mention of, where at one point in time, I would not want to be categorical about that particular instance, but we know, for instance, that there are accusing fingers that have been pointing at Rwanda. And when I say Rwanda here, I'm referring to President Paul Kagame particularly, where they think that he is somehow the person behind the M23 sponsoring them to some sort of achieve what he intends to in that part of Africa, where it is believed that some of the people who are there initially from Rwanda are those who sponsored or took part actively in the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And so some people think that Paul Kagame has been behind them, supporting them to or sponsoring the conflict in that part of the continent, to be able to deal with all those who masterminded the genocide. So you understand that where we find ourselves in, like I earlier said, there are several factors that account for them, be they issues that stem from the pre-colonial to the post-colonial era, be they issues of bad governance, or even just matters of let me say some sort of greed, where we have people and leaders in Africa who think of themselves first, they think of themselves second, and they think of themselves third. They do not believe that after them, there is any other person or there are other people that will need to continue leading the country. It's as though after them, the continent will die in natural death. So with all these things combined, with the rate of unemployment that we find in the continent, you understand that when people become so bent up in anger, of course, at one point in time, and they cannot be given the room to express themselves politically, they try to seek other means and measures to be able to let their voices heard. When you think of Boko Haram, for instance, in the northern part of Cameroon and then Nigeria, for instance, you understand that some of these people easily get recruits into their ranks. Why? Because those are the recruits are people who have been suffering from marginalization, people who have been stigmatized tribally, people who have not been given the room to share in the national cake in their respective countries. And so they now think that the only way that they can make themselves heard is by joining such camps where arms are being used. So I think, madam, those are some of the things that account as to why we find ourselves where we are today when we talk about insecurity.
Thank you, Mr. Mbane, for that elaborate contribution. Over to you, Mr. Kumba. We saw the Rwandan and the Congolese President Paul Kagame and President Felix Tshisekedi, that met in Angola to see how they could talk about peace regarding the M23 rebels. Now, would you say that this actually failed because the M23 rebels actually came back to actually reject this peace deal? Would you say it's because all the parties involved were not put on a dialogue table?
You said it all, exactly. You cannot organize a peace agreement without having the principal actor to all the atrocities and those who are claiming, in quotes, their rights according to a failed peace agreement in 2009, not being present, and you expect things to work normally. So that is why I always talk about bad governance, because I think that we are in a democratic atmosphere where leadership is not the one which existed before, like in the 60s, in the 50s, where it was very, very authoritative. Now, the concept of leadership has changed, and it requires leaders to be able to have that relationship with their population, to be able to discuss with them like equals, because that is one of the fundamental human rights which is being enshrined in the convention or the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that all individuals should be treated as equals.
Exactly.
So I think our leaders should rethink their way of leading people, to rethink their way of relating with the population. They have to know that they are not bigger than the population.
Exactly. You have seen this in Rwanda, where President Paul Kagame, he goes out to the streets and feel free.
Exactly. Exactly. So they have to know that it's the population that gave them the power.
Yes.
And that if they are leaders, they are to be at the service of the population. So in this case, we know that certainly those of the M23, a majority of them are Congolese.
Yes.
So, and it's impossible to, it's true that they have committed a lot of atrocities, but you know, there is a UN principle called trading justice for peace. So it's one of the principles that have been used by the UN, even with the President Charles Taylor, because at one point they realized that when you pick up a leader and you punish him, the movement still continues, because the people still feel disgruntled and they feel that there have been some sort of injustice that has been done towards them. So automatically the revolution keeps going and going and going and going. So it's very important for presidents to understand that when each time there is a conflict, they have to go towards the people, they have to go towards the principal actors and discuss with them. It's indispensable to get peace.
Exactly. If we have to stay in that light of Rwanda, I would like to take a look at the recent incarceration of the top Rwandan official that was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Now he was sentenced because he was involved in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. When you look at this, would you affirm that when persons are held accountable for their actions, insecurity can be reduced on the continent?
Well, we have to know that, as I earlier said, bad governance is one of those factors that can lead to insecurity.
Yes.
But we also have social injustice. So, as my co-panel member said, it could take so many forms.
Exactly,
So you could have food insecurity. You could even have climate insecurity, because there are even insecurities in Africa that have been linked to climate change. So we have to know that what happened in Rwanda in 1994 is considered as one of the most grievous crimes. So it's an international crime, genocide. And for peace to reign, some sort of justice had to be done. Not only be done, but must be seen to be done, so that those who were being hurt will feel that, okay, there's some sort of justice that has been done towards them, and they will be able to forget the situation and move on. So I think that condemning this person, this top official, is an act of justice, and it is important for security purposes.
Now, he's not the only one.
Yeah, he's not the only one. There have been so many of them. I think.
Yeah, exactly.
In between 1994 and
1996, 1998, yeah, about 22 persons were being shot to death. So that is what has been happening there in the East African country.
Yeah. So it's important for people to be punished for their crimes, and that will help other citizens who could have a grudge to be at peace and to move on.
Exactly. We just want to recall that the members of that genocide, some of them are still trying to reconnect with their families. Away from that, Mr. Mbane, back to you. We're still talking Rwanda. Looking at the recent conviction of the top Rwandan official, what do you have to say, or how can you assess this verdict?
Okay, what I would say is that when it comes to human rights violations, I think anybody who violates human rights has to pay the price. You see, but now there is a problem. That is like my co-panelist has just said. It is an act of justice. You see, he's paying for something he did. We all agree. It's normal. We accept it. But we need to be very careful, because in our African context and in our African politics, we play politics in another different way. What do I mean by this? We tribalize things such that at the end of the day, you may be convicting someone for something he actually did, but members of his immediate community will think or see it as an injustice upon one of theirs. And so they rather go retaliating, and it rather creates more trouble in the land. You see, this is to tell you that maybe as it's one of the solutions to the several conflicts that we have or the insecurity in Africa, one thing we need to understand as Africans, and which our leaders need to put in place, is to let Africans understand the need for togetherness. People should not always think that a leader is a leader to me because he comes from my village, because he comes from my tribe, because he comes from my ethnic background. Without which, if that is the case, then you understand no matter whoever you are sentencing for a crime he committed, members of his immediate community will always want to see it from the other way around. So I don't have a problem if someone violated human rights and today he's being sentenced justly for what he did. I think it's but normal. But we need to be sure that the minds of the people from that ethnic back group where he comes from are also worked upon to see things from the right perspective. I think that's what I can say with respect to that particular verdict from Rwanda. We know 1994 till now is not so long a period of time, and the memories of that genocide are still very, very fresh in the minds of the people. So I would simply rather be advising that the authorities in that country and all other people are partnering with Rwanda in the fight against or in trying to resolve the issues of the genocide. They should be very, very careful the way they go about it, without which you can be sentencing someone today and rather creating more trouble for tomorrow. So I think that's what I can say with respect to that.
Thank you, sir. Over to you, Mr. Kumba. When you look at your medical expert here in Cameroon, when you look at the effect of the aftermath of insecurity on the victims, how would you, given your capacity as a medical professional, what would you say?
Well, the effects of the crisis,
because it leads to the displacement of persons, human rights violations, just to name this few.
So I would think I would say that the crisis has had a very great impact in the health sector. Considering the facts that, as you said, that people have been, first of all, displaced in different directions, because there are people who have been displaced.
Let's look at Cameroon. People have left the northwest and southwest, and they find themselves in different areas where they had never imagined they were going to be before.
Exactly. And for example, you have a few of them who migrated towards Douala, and they live in new quarters. So new quarters where you don't even have water, new quarters where you don't even have light.
A new environment, insecurity. We're still talking about insecurity.
Exactly. But we are more towards like health insecurity. So you see these people, they are prone to have diseases, waterborne diseases, like typhoid, like dysenteries. You see, those are the type of diseases that can be linked with the fact that they are living in areas which are not well accommodated with water facilities and other facilities which are necessary for their living. Moreover, those who have decided to stay back, there are so many hospitals that have been destroyed. Like a few weeks ago, you have the Manfred District Hospital that was completely burnt down. So you see now the population will not have access to health care. So those are the type of consequences we have. Others have displaced themselves. They don't even have a place to live. And we have girls who have gone now into prostitution. So it's really a sad situation. And I think we have to sit down and resolve this problem, because the consequences just keep getting worse and worse every day.
Exactly. We talk of health. When we look at, say, the tavern killings in South Africa, for example, that is something, I think, when you have to look at something like this type of human interest case, someone might be tempted to say that sometimes the governments of these various African countries are not giving the right information out there. What do you think?
Well, it's very, very difficult, because there's a lot of disinformation on the internet. But I think when you see, like, you look at the tavern killings and they tell you that majority of those who were being killed were below 17 years.
Yes, and 20.
They were found, they were found in a bar. And in South Africa, you are only allowed to drink or to go to bars
you're 18 and
when
plus.
you're 18. So we don't need to go deep into the details to know that the children already had a poor education.
Yes.
Because if these children were well trained by the different institutions, academic institutions that are put in place by the state, they will know that they are not supposed to find themselves in bars at a particular time if they have not gotten to the age of majority. Secondly, the parents have also failed in their training, in the upbringing of the child, because if the state has its own responsibilities, but the family, the parents, also have their own responsibilities towards the children, and they have to educate their children to be good citizens. So from this, for me, I would stay there. I don't need to go into details to know if it's because they drank too much or the like, but I always look at things from a preventive point of view.
Yes.
So if they were well brought up by the state and well brought up by their parents, they won't even, or well controlled, they won't even find themselves there. And the sin would have never ever taken place.
But you say you don't want to go further, but I'm tempted to really ask you a question.
Okay.
Like, what could have pushed persons to take up guns, to go into a tavern and kill so young people?
Well, as we've said from the beginning, there are situations of social injustice.
Yes.
So those are the things that actually push people maybe to feel marginalized, to feel that there's some sort of discrimination, and they begin to come up with ideas or ideologies, ideologies that are aimed at maybe sending a message across that okay, we are being marginalized, but we think that you people are the cause, and if we do this, you people have to know that you people are stepping across. So we will see that these ideologies actually entrave or find their ways into people's way of thinking, into people's way of reasoning, and it is quite surprising that you see that most of the conflicts which are actually in Africa are related to cultural and tribal differences. So it's not even too linked with, I don't know, the food insecurity and the rest. It's true that it's also an issue, but if you look at most of our conflicts in Africa, they are always related to cultural and tribal
you can say that this insecurity actually stems from there.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that elaborate contribution. Over to you, Mr. Mbane. I wish to ask if you have any suggestions that could be put in place by different heads of state to make sure that we curb insecurity on the continent.
The suggestions, they are there, madam. You know, first thing I would say, the heads of states, the governments in place, the regimes in place should be able to be transparent in their governance such that the people can at least begin by having some trust in them. You know, because when we talk of insecurity, it's a lack of what? It's a matter of what? Uncertainty. You govern a people who are not certain about their tomorrow. You govern a people who are not certain about what they will eat the next day. You govern a people who are not certain about their health situation. You govern a people who are not certain about their health facilities or social amenities and all whatnot. And you govern a people who do not even in any way relate or identify themselves with you. It becomes a problem. So the heads of states and the regimes in place should begin by enabling these people have trust in them. They should create an enabling environment where the masses can feel like the people we had at the helm of management are working for us, and so we can count on them, we can trust them. But if you govern people who do not in any way relate with you, who in any way do not feel like you are actually working to their best interest, then there is bound to be insecurity in the land. Secondly, heads of state should understand that we are in a developing world and the people have their viewpoints to share. Especially when these viewpoints become political, they must understand that political viewpoints must be debated upon and settled politically, and not through brutality, not through marginalization, not through stigmatization or intimidation or anything of the sort. Because that's another thing too, where in Africa, leaders become so ruthless in their way of treating those who do not share their viewpoints, and of course it can only at the end of the day push the others into wanting to think that they will use but force this time around to be able to get their voices heard. So our leaders should understand the need for a democratic process where you may not agree with somebody, but the person should have his right to express his viewpoint and go scot-free without any form of imprisonment or intimidation or whatsoever thing. The third thing I would say is that there is something I would call African democracy. You know, it is common today to hear everybody about democracy, democracy, democracy. But one thing is that they are trying to force it upon Africans. When I say they, I mean the Western world and our present leaders, who think that we can just copy what happens in the Western world and we paste in the African society and it works. I would say no. We as Africans, before the colonial period, we had a way of governance, a way of leading or ruling our people that did not actually go with the way the Western world sees it. So we may copy something from the Western world, which is good, or what they call democracy today, but when we bring it out to Africa, we need to adapt it to our own context and not just want to paste, because that's another problem. There are circumstances, there are things that we want to apply in Africa today that may not work for the people, that the people may not necessarily feel comfortable with them, because we are just trying to paste. And unfortunately, we do not even just try to paste, but we copy certain things and we come and we implement them the wrong way. So it leads me to the next point, which is what? Implementation. We have, in some cases, either very bad laws that still need to be amended, or laws that are actually good but are poorly implemented. These again are things that our lawmakers and the leaders in place need to look into, because if all these things are put in place such that people identify and they feel comfortable with all these parameters and everybody feels like he or she belongs to his society or community, then I want to think that the degree of insecurity will drastically reduce. I will also mention the issue of the men of God. I'm sorry to say it here and to disappoint the pastors in Africa, the church leaders in Africa. I challenge them, because I believe that the churches in Africa today are one of the root causes to insecurity in Africa. Why do I say they are a root cause? A root cause because they have permanently brainwashed Africans by letting them think that they should not get involved in things that are political, and that when we do not feel comfortable about things happening in our continent or respective countries, all we need to do is go down on our knees, raise our hands to heaven and pray to God, and then solutions will come spiritually. I am not against prayers, but we must understand prayers will only come into accompany the physical action. Men of God should understand they need to encourage Africans to get involved in the political affairs of their countries and the continent, because whatever thing we do is first and foremost political. If today a cube of savon you bought for 200 francs is 500 francs, it is a political decision, and it is not through prayers that you will pray and then the price will drop from 500 francs back to 200 or to 100 francs. So I think somewhere, somehow, our men of God are not doing what they are supposed to do. They shy away from the truth by not speaking it out the way it is. They do not want to talk about justice in the country, in Africa. They do not want to talk about the violation of human rights, but they think that we can only pray and things change. I disagree, and I think they too are contributing enormously in causing our people to remain so bad when it comes to the political situation in our country. And maybe the last thing I will mention here, madam, will be on the issue of education. Governments in place should rethink the educational systems we have. In most cases, I want to take the case of Cameroon. We are still into an educational system that was inherited from the colonial masters that do not benefit us. at the end of the day, I always like to insist on the fact that we have been training people for the past 60 years who only know how to read and write. They cannot gainfully do anything for themselves. So at the end of the day, the rate of unemployment continuously grows. And the more people you have who are unemployed, the high chances for such people to eventually join the ranks of those who will term terrorists, because they will now want to use force and brutality to be able to earn a living for themselves. But if we review or if we rethink our educational system and we adapt it to our context, then I think we can train people who can be able to at least gainfully employ themselves, and so cater for themselves and their immediate families, and why not employ one or two other persons. And by so doing, I think again people will be more focused on doing that which can help them and help the countries and the continent than thinking of how they can use other unscrupulous means if they want to earn a living for themselves within the continent.
Exactly. You did mention a lot of powerful points, but let me stay on the point you mentioned about unemployment. Now, we want to remember the incident of Abuja, Kaduna, the train attack that happened there in Nigeria. And according to some of the victims, they said the persons that attacked were young persons. So how will you term this? Now, the young persons in the continent are taking up arms to make sure that the effect or the kill or how do I say the threaten other members of the continent. What is your take on this?
Well, I will not pretend to say those who attacked were forcefully out of unemployment. They might have had other motivations. We should not also deny the fact that there are some people who are just criminals and will use any means to earn a living, not unnecessarily a matter of unemployment anyway. And you know, again, there is this issue when you talk about Nigeria, we know with Boko Haram there, we know that at one point in time it becomes more of a religious issue too, if we are referring to Boko Haram, for instance. So what I would rather say again here is that still in line with education, governments, church authorities, parents, every member of the society, every stakeholder should take that responsibility such that we can train, we can educate our people too, our youth, to grow up with a certain degree of moral consciousness. Because at one point in time, we must be honest to ourselves to say, it is not necessarily because you are unemployed that you must go violent in the society. No, you may be unemployed and your unemployment pushes you to think things otherwise. We have seen other African youths too, who never went to school, but some of them today are manufacturers. We have seen other African youths who never went to school, but they do other things to be able to keep themselves gainfully employed and helpful to the communities. So we should not just pretend to think that all those who pick up arms and go violent, it is as a consequence of unemployment and other not. That's not what we are saying. So I think we simply need to also educate the young to understand that, to enable them grow with a certain degree of moral consciousness as to what they owe the society. We all have duties and we have responsibilities, and we must take them up from that perspective.
Exactly, you said it all, that we all have duties and responsibilities, and we actually have to act that way. Okay, over to you, Mr. Nkumba. Before I ask your suggestions, I would like to find out if there are any legal implications if the perpetrators of these acts of insecurity are brought to justice.
Yeah, we're talking about the M23?
Yes, M23, we're talking about jihadis, we're talking about terrorists in Nigeria, we're talking about every act of insecurity across the continent.
Okay, so according to international laws, most of these atrocities which are being committed by rebels are being provided for by the Rome Statute. So the Rome Statute is actually a convention that was adopted in 1998 and it was implemented in 2002. So it creates the International Criminal Court. So in this convention, there are 4 types of crimes which are recognized as international crimes. So we have genocides, we have crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. And if we notice from the different atrocities that have been perpetrated by rebels, we realize that most of them will fall either under genocide, under crimes against humanity. So when you have such a situation, automatically the country where the act has been perpetrated, if that country is a member state to this international convention, then it has jurisdiction to try those people, because the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court is a jurisdiction of last resort. So you have to start trying the people where the atrocity was being committed, or it might be committed in another country, but the perpetrator finds his or herself in a country that has jurisdiction, and
It's not a member state, for example.
if the country is not a member state, then there's no jurisdiction. The country is a member state. The act was not perpetrated in the member state, but was perpetrated in another state that is a member state. So he has jurisdiction. So those are the circumstances where you can actually have jurisdiction to try people. So if you are not able, because in certain cases, as our co-panelist earlier said, he said that there are situations where if you pick up some of these people, you're going to instead make things worse. So in that case, you will not be able to try that person there. If you could get hold of that person, then you can transfer him to the International Criminal Court for him to be tried there. So that is what can be done to them. But getting hold of them also is something very, very difficult, because at a particular point you have to make use of the armed forces to be able to go to their hiding places, attack them and pick them up, so that justice should be done to them.
Yeah, we might borrow examples from what's happening across the African continent. We have had people that come, they perpetrate bad acts, then they go out of the continent, say to Western countries, and they protect themselves there.
Yeah, that's a rather very unfortunate situation, because sometimes we have the impression that certain foreign countries are protecting criminals.
Exactly.
So, and this particular case, we see it in Rwanda, where you have so many perpetrators, those who in one way or the other instigated the genocide.
Yes.
And they were able to flee, and they went to foreign countries like Belgium, France, and they were there.
That was the case with Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso.
Exactly. Who even went back to the country.
He went to Ivory Coast and he was protected. For several years now, he goes to the country and there's nothing.
There's nothing.
Yes, he's not yet been apprehended.
So those are one of the difficulties that the justice system also faces. So if justice cannot be implemented, then there is actually no justice. And that is the reason why Africa needs to have leaders who put in place very, very strong institutions. Yeah, very strong institutions. And that does not only go by having an institution in place, but it also goes by changing the mentality of the population, for them to know that those who commit crimes have to be punished, because there are so many Africans who even believe that certain criminals are not criminals. For example, in Rwanda, we have Rwandans who Hutus who have been condemned, who still believe that the genocide they committed is correct. Correct.
Most of them, they cover themselves under the canopy of I have a top, I have a top personality. There's nothing that this country can do. You understand? That's what actually happened. That's what's killing the African continent.
So you can imagine. You can imagine all of these things. So it's time for us Africans to really sit down and rethink the way we have to build our continent. We have to all know that we are one. We are all Africans, and Africa is a continent that can even be a country in the nearest future. That's if we want. If we all sit down together in solidarity or put our hands together, we'll be able to do so many great things. So those are one of the issues the justice system faces. And it's not only there, but even in Cameroon, we have some of those issues where we have sentences which are not able to be implemented in one way or the other because of certain situations in courts.
Okay, down with that. So what are your suggestions that African leaders can actually learn in order to curb insecurity on the continent?
So for me, the first thing is that African leaders have to put in place mechanisms to be able to make Africans feel that they are a nation, first of all. And to do that, they have to put in place strategies which will help Africans to be able to collaborate with each other. So we'll talk about building roads,
Yes.
national, trans-regional roads that will permit maybe a Cameroonian to leave from Cameroon with a car to go to Rwanda. So that will be able to foster relationships between
and development too.
And development also between the different African countries. And by working together, they will be able to see that, okay, actually they are one, and that they all have a common goal, which is to foster our African continent. So the first thing is that the governments have to actually encourage the notion of a nation amongst the African people, that we are one people.
Yeah, I want to recall that Muammar Gaddafi of Libya had actually thought of this. Kwame Nkrumah actually saw African continent as a country.
Exactly.
Yes, so that is what's happening.
Okay.
So briefly,
so that's the first thing. So the second thing is good governance.
Exactly, you did mention that earlier.
Yeah, so good governance for me, it's the foundation. Because if you look at all the issues we are having in Africa today, they are all related to bad governance. It's true that there are certain conflicts which started before independence, but we'll realize that after independence, maybe for a few decades, things seemed a little bit stable in Africa. Then afterwards, rebellion resurged. So if we look at those who were leading at the period, we'll see that they led poorly. They were not able to integrate everybody into the affair concerning governance. So some people felt left aside, some people felt marginalized, some people felt that in one way or the other they were discriminated upon, and that's what made them to feel like they don't belong, they are not part, and that might be on their own, or if they form their own nation, they will be able to have a better political atmosphere. So good governance is very, very important, and it cuts across everything: education, health, culture, sports, infrastructure. It cuts just across everything. Food security, environmental protection, all those things are part of good governance. And lastly, we need social justice. So social justice in all its forms. So today, so many people complain that there's a lot of discrimination with regards to work, with regards to education, with regards to access of youths to certain professions. Like you have just imagined today, since 2014, the Cameroonian Bar Association has not launched any entrance exams. So you imagine I have thousands of friends out there who want to be lawyers, and they cannot, just because the bar has not organized any entrance examination, and that is almost 8 years now. So these are the type of things that frustrate the youths, and when the youths are frustrated, they could have different ideas, and they could resort to violence, which are things we don't want. So social justice is really, really important in our society, and that has to be put in place by the government. So I think if we go by these three, certainly we'll be able to resolve 90% of the insecurity problems we are having, considering that there is another 10% that can be out of the reach or out of our potentials.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Mbane, you might want to give some last words before we part ways.
Just in line with what my brother has just said, and in addition to the fact of the points I earlier mentioned already, I would simply say our African leaders it is time they start thinking about a possible political transition in Africa. We have very old leaders in Africa, very old regimes, some of them that have never even been productive in the first place and are not still productive till today, but still want to keep holding tight to power. They need to start thinking of how to let power change hands, and so that some new blood can come in and come up with new ideas. Because I believe you me, in Africa today we have a brand of young Africans who have a total different view or way of letting Africa forge ahead, as opposed to the old leaders we have, many of whom, I'm sorry to say, have really never worked to the best interest of the continent. So we need to think about a change of power in the different African countries and governments that we now do have. Secondly, we need powerful institutions. Today we talk about the AU, for instance. I want to think we need to go, Africans need to understand the need for an African union, a union where we actually unite in the real sense of the term, and we become a country where we speak as one person with one voice. Why do you think that the European Union is constantly coming together and putting in place principles on how to trade with other continents and Africa? It is because they have understood that once they are united, then they can easily make progress. Unfortunately, they sit down, they talk as a people, and then when they come back to Africa, Africans welcome them as individual African states, and of course, it cannot work from that perspective. The AU needs to be an AU that actually works in the line with the views of people like late Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who wanted a united Africa where we talk as a country with a single voice. Then we should also understand that it is all about politics. We must learn to detach ourselves from the Western world, because these people will never support unity in Africa. That is why you also understand that one of the factors that promotes insecurity in Africa today is the fact that some of the wars are sponsored by some of these European countries. We need to detach ourselves from them. In what perspective? Understand that we are a people, and that when we have our differences, we can always resolve them within ourselves and amongst ourselves as a people. We must not want to think that a solution that has to do with our problems must come from Europe. I still want to come back to Cameroon. It is unfortunate at times when we give ourselves the impression that if France or Britain does not talk, then the Anglophone crisis, for instance, in Cameroon cannot be resolved. No, it is very, very poor of us as a people to think from that perspective, and we claim that we are a sovereign state and that we gained independence since over 60 years today.
Mr. Mbane, sorry to cut you short, Mr. Mbane. We shall be discussing the Anglophone crisis in subsequent editions, but quite right today we're discussing insecurity. So could you just give us a brief summary? Yes.
Well, I was just citing it as an instance to say that one of the problems we face with insecurity in Africa is the fact that when we have our internal issues at times, we make the world think that if ideas do not come from the diaspora, from the Western world, then we cannot solve those issues. But forgetting the fact that those people only come there with their political interest. They only come to propose that which they know at the end of the day will permit them to get a little more. So I think in a nutshell, what I can say is that it is time we as a people, we as a continent, we start sitting down to talk as a people around the table and think of how we can resolve our issues to be able to push our continent to forge ahead. Thank you.
Thank you too, Mr. Mbane. Thank you immensely for taking out time out of your busy schedule to join us on today's edition of Voice It.
Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Mr. Kumba. Would you like to give any brief words before we part ways?
Well, to all Cameroonians, to all Africans, we have to know that we are a nation and that we have to really work hand in hand to resolve our issues. We are not an inferior race, we are not an inferior continent, but we are actually a continent with very big potential. And we believe that if we are able to put our hands together, we can do extraordinary things. So my encouragement to all Africans is that we should really stay together and we should keep our unity, we should keep our solidarity, and that we should resolve our issues all together.
Umbutu. Thank you so much for taking our time to join us on today's edition.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on our guest list this afternoon, we had Mr. Ason Kumar, a legal expert as well as a medical doctor. We equally had Mr. Njine Bane, who is the National Communications Secretary for the Popular Actions Party. Thank you immensely for joining us on this edition of Voice It as we actually analyze insecurity on the African continent. More beautiful programs will be coming up over for you media. Stay tuned.